I left the country after the divorce, branded as the bitter ex-wife who fled in shame. My ex instantly married his mistress in a lavish ceremony funded by dirty money. But right in the middle of their extravagant wedding, a guest exposed a horrifying financial secret that brought federal agents to their reception. And even after losing everything, he still had the nerve to call me from a holding cell. I am Isla, 33 years old, and I spent the last 6 months tracking millions of stolen dollars across international borders. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned the tables on someone who thought they destroyed you. The late afternoon sun cast a golden cinematic glow over the sprawling Napa Valley vineyard. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open doors for guests stepping out of luxury vehicles, creating a chaotic symphony of revving engines and polite greetings. I adjusted the collar of my tailored blazer, feeling the cool autumn breeze against my skin as I approached the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. Connor had spared no expense for his $2 million wedding to Brittany. The irony of standing at the threshold of a celebration, paid for entirely by corporate fraud, was not lost on me. Before I could even reach the security podium, a sharp voice cut through the ambient chatter and the classical string music playing from hidden speakers in the garden. "What on earth are you doing here, Isla?" I turned to see Brenda marching toward me with alarming speed. My former mother-in-law wore an icy glare that perfectly matched the expensive silver silk of her designer dress. She positioned herself directly between me and the private security guards, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, effectively creating a human barricade. "Connor bought you a one-way ticket to Europe to hide your shame," Brenda hissed, her voice low, but dripping with absolute venom. "Are you here to beg for leftovers? Or did you just come to ruin my son's perfect day because you could not secure a successful man of your own?" I did not flinch, nor did I offer the emotional reaction she was clearly desperate to provoke. For years during my marriage to Connor, I had swallowed Brenda's elitist insults. She had always despised my middle-class background, constantly reminding me that I was merely a public university graduate who worked a boring desk job while her son was a brilliant Silicon Valley venture capitalist destined for greatness. When Connor filed for divorce 6 months ago to be with Brittany, he transferred a meager, insulting settlement into my account and told his entire social circle that I was fleeing to Europe out of sheer humiliation. Brenda fully believed I had spent the last half-year crying myself to sleep in a cheap overseas hostel. She had no idea that my career as a forensic corporate auditor had actually taken me to Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. I had not been hiding. I had been tracing the heavily encrypted offshore accounts and the exact serial numbers of the stolen funds paying for the extravagant floral arrangements currently surrounding us. I looked at Brenda with a calm, completely flat expression. Instead of arguing or defending my presence, I simply reached into the pocket of my slacks and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen to open a digital invitation and stepped smoothly around her toward the security scanner. The guard held out his handheld device. I placed my bright screen under the red laser. A pleasant chime sounded instantly, and the digital display flashed a bright green VIP access granted message for all to see. Brenda's jaw practically unhinged. She stared at the glowing green light on the scanner as if it had offended her personally. "Connor sent me the VIP invite." "Himself, Brenda," I said smoothly, sliding my phone back into my pocket without breaking eye contact. "He explicitly wanted me to be front and center to watch him win. It would be incredibly rude of me to miss such an expensive theatrical performance." Brenda stammered, struggling to formulate a response to my blatant defiance. Her carefully manicured hands twitched at her sides. "You have no right to be here," she finally spat out, though the supreme confidence she possessed just moments ago had visibly cracked. "You are just an embittered ex-wife, obsessed with a man who upgraded to a younger, much more beautiful model. You do not belong among these people." I offered her a polite, entirely hollow smile. "Do not worry about me causing a scene, Brenda. I am strictly here as an observer today. Enjoy the champagne. I hear it is imported directly from France." I walked past her, leaving her fuming speechlessly by the iron gates, and stepped onto the pristine cobblestone path leading to the main reception area. The sheer scale of the event was staggering, almost nauseating in its excess. Massive crystal chandeliers were suspended from the branches of ancient oak trees, catching the fading sunlight. Waitstaff in formal attire circulated seamlessly with silver trays of caviar, truffles, and top-tier spirits. Every single detail screamed unlimited wealth. To the average guest attending this gathering, it was a flawless fairy tale wedding. To a forensic accountant like me, it was a massive, glittering crime scene. I knew exactly which offshore shell companies Connor had used to launder the money funding this display. I knew the specific names of the investors he had ruthlessly defrauded to pay for the custom silk table linens and the towering imported floral arches. I was mentally calculating the exorbitant cost of the massive ice sculptures flanking the bar when a sudden sharp commotion near the bridal tent caught my attention. The heavy ornate wooden doors of the bridal suite flew open with a dramatic bang. Brittany emerged, surrounded by a flock of frantic, fawning bridesmaids. She looked every bit the vapid lifestyle influencer she was so desperate to be portrayed as, draped in a custom Vera Wang gown that sparkled aggressively with thousands of hand-sewn crystals. Her eyes scanned the courtyard and locked onto me almost instantly. She whispered something to her maid of honor, her face twisting into a malicious sneer, before she broke away from the group and marched purposefully in my direction. I stood perfectly still, watching her approach like a storm gathering speed. She held a crystal flute brimming with dark red wine, her manicured fingers gripping the delicate glass tightly. As she came within 2 feet of me, she feigned a sudden exaggerated stumble. Her hand jerked forward violently, and the entire glass of dark staining liquid splashed directly across the toes of my beige suede shoes. I did not jump back. I did not gasp. I just stared down at the dark crimson liquid soaking into the suede of my favorite pumps. The wine dripped off the pointed toe, forming a small red puddle on the pristine white cobblestones of the vineyard driveway. Brittany let out a high-pitched theatrical gasp that was loud enough to turn the heads of the nearest dozen guests. "Oh my gosh, I am so incredibly sorry, Isla." She pressed her hand to her chest, glittering with diamonds. "I just did not expect you to be standing right there. I mean, who stands by the security gates after being denied entry?" I looked up from my ruined shoes to meet her perfectly contoured face. Her eyes held zero apology. They were bright with the thrill of the kill. She stepped closer, ensuring the wealthy guests standing near the champagne tower could hear every single word of our interaction. "Careful, Isla." Brittany said, her voice dripping with weaponized sweetness as she raised her left hand to brush a non-existent piece of lint from my shoulder. She made sure her wrist was right in my line of sight, flashing a massive diamond engagement ring and an ornate gold watch that caught the California sunlight. "Connor bought me this vintage Patek Philippe as a wedding gift this morning. It costs more than you made in 5 years at that boring desk job of yours. It would be a shame if you got your cheap wine stains all over it." The surrounding guests murmured. A few of Brenda's country club friends actually chuckled into their champagne flutes. They were waiting for me to break. They wanted the bitter, discarded ex-wife to scream or cry or run away in humiliation down the long, winding driveway of the estate. They wanted a show. Instead, I calmly reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a crisp white handkerchief. I slowly knelt down, wiping the excess wine from my shoe with methodical precision. I took my time, letting the silence stretch and the tension build in the warm autumn air. When I stood back up, I did not look at her perfectly made-up face. I looked directly at the heavy gold watch strapped to her wrist. I leaned in close enough to smell her overwhelming floral perfume. "That is fascinating, Brittany." I kept my voice low but perfectly clear, carrying the sharp edge of absolute certainty. Especially since Patek Philippe never made that specific vintage model with a sweeping quartz movement. Brittany froze, her hand still suspended in the air. The smug smile on her face faltered, cracking just a fraction. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, pulling her arm back against her chest. I tilted my head, studying the watch with a professional eye. The second hand is ticking. A real mechanical watch glides smoothly without a single sound. Yours is ticking like a cheap wall clock. Connor bought that in a black market in Macau during his business trip last month. I know because I audited the exact offshore wire transfer he used to pay the counterfeiter. I paused, letting the truth sink into her perfectly highlighted skin. But do not worry. I offered her a freezing smile. Fake things suit this marriage perfectly. The color drained from Brittany's face completely. The bright California sun suddenly seemed to highlight the sheer panic in her eyes as she glanced down at her wrist and then frantically back at me. She opened her mouth to scream to call me a liar, but the words caught in her throat. She knew I was right. She had probably suspected it all morning. Before she could find her voice to argue, she snapped her fingers toward the cocktail bar. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The light jazz music seemed to fade into the background as heavy footsteps crunched on the cobblestones behind me. 3 of Connor's groomsmen materialized from the crowd. They were college fraternity brothers turned Silicon Valley tech executives dressed in matching tailored tuxedos. They moved with the entitled swagger of men who were used to buying their way out of consequences. They formed a tight semicircle around me, cutting off my path to the main reception tent and backing me directly against the thick stone wall of the estate gates. "Is there a problem here, Brittany?" the tallest groomsman asked. His name was Greg, a man who once tried to expense a luxury yacht rental as a business tax deduction until I caught it in the quarterly review. He glared down at me, flexing his shoulders under his expensive suit jacket. "She is harassing me, Greg," Brittany said, her voice trembling as she quickly played the victim for her audience. "She sneaked in here, and now she is saying insane things about Connor. She needs to leave right now." Greg stepped forward, invading my personal space. The scent of expensive cologne and cheap whiskey rolled off him. "You heard the bride, Isla. Time to go. You do not belong here. You had your chance with Connor and you blew it. Now turn around and walk back down that driveway before we have to physically remove you." The other 2 groomsmen shifted closer, boxing me in completely. Their bodies formed a solid wall of intimidation, blocking the sunlight and casting a dark shadow over me. This was exactly how Connor operated. When he could not win with intellect, he used physical presence and brute force to silence his opposition. He surrounded himself with men who would do his dirty work so his own hands remained completely clean. I stood my ground, trapped between the cold stone wall and 3 large men ready to drag me out into the dirt. I did not break eye contact with Greg. I calculated the exact distance between the security podium and my current position. I knew a single shout would alert the valet staff, but I also knew that reacting with fear was exactly what they wanted. I was a forensic accountant. I dealt in facts, numbers, and leverage. Physical intimidation was just another desperate tactic used by men with something to hide. "You are not going to touch me, Greg," I said, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. "Because if you put a single finger on my suit, I will personally make sure the Federal Revenue Service audits your ridiculous tech startup for the next 10 consecutive years. I still have the encrypted files detailing your illegal write-offs from your last vacation." Greg hesitated, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his frat boy features. He looked at the other men, silently communicating his sudden doubt. But the groomsman to his left stepped forward, ignoring my warning, and reaching out to grab my upper arm with a heavy, aggressive hand. "We are not asking nicely, Isla," he growled, leaning in to grab my shoulder. The heavy hand never made contact with my shoulder. A fraction of a second before the groomsman could grab my suit jacket, a massive palm clamped down on his wrist with the force of a steel vice. The groomsman gasped, his knees buckling slightly under the sudden crushing pressure. I did not flinch. I just shifted my gaze to the man who had silently materialized beside me. DeAndre towered over the frat boys, at 6'3", with the broad, disciplined shoulders of a former military officer. He possessed the kind of physical authority that did not require him to raise his voice. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his expression completely unreadable as he stared down at the groomsman whose wrist he was currently compressing. "We do not touch the guests, Brad," DeAndre said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that instantly drained the bravado from the 3 tech executives. Greg puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his pride in front of the other groomsmen. "She was harassing the bride, DeAndre. Connor wants her gone. We were just handling the trash." DeAndre did not release his grip on Brad's wrist. Instead, he applied a fraction more pressure, causing the man to wince and rise up on his tiptoes. "You are groomsmen, not bouncers," DeAndre replied smoothly. "I handle the security for my brother-in-law. I will escort Isla to the exit. You three go back to the champagne tower before you wrinkle your rented tuxedos." He released Brad with a slight shove. The three men exchanged furious, humiliated glances, but none of them dared to argue with Connor's brother-in-law. They muttered under their breath and stalked back toward the reception tent, leaving me alone with the one person in this family I had never quite figured out. DeAndre turned to me, adjusting his cuffs with slow, deliberate movements. He was married to Connor's sister, Sydney. Throughout my miserable marriage, DeAndre had always been the quiet observer in the corner of the room. He rarely participated in Brenda's vicious gossip sessions, and he never engaged in Connor's competitive boasting. As a commercial airline pilot, he was frequently away on international routes, avoiding the toxic family dynamics entirely. "Let us take a walk, Isla." He gestured toward a secluded stone patio overlooking the sprawling vineyards far away from the prying eyes of the wedding guests. I fell into step beside him, my posture rigid. I was calculating exactly how much of a threat he posed. If Connor had sent him to quietly muscle me out of the venue, DeAndre would find out very quickly that I was not the same woman who had silently signed the divorce papers 6 months ago. When we reached the empty patio, DeAndre stepped up to a small, unattended satellite bar. He poured 2 glasses of neat bourbon from a crystal decanter. He handed one to me, his dark eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me grip the glass tighter. "You look sharp, Isla," DeAndre said, taking a slow sip of his drink. He leaned back against the stone railing, crossing his ankles. "The rest of the family thinks you have been hiding in Europe, crying yourself to sleep. Brenda has been telling everyone who will listen that you are living in a cheap hostel, drowning your sorrows." I took a sip of the bourbon, letting the burn ground me. "What do you think, DeAndre?" A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "I think my wife's family is incredibly stupid. They see a quiet woman and assume she is weak. But I pay attention. I know your background. I know you are a forensic corporate auditor. And I know a forensic accountant does not spend 6 months bouncing between Switzerland and the Cayman Islands just to get a tan." My grip on the glass tightened, but my expression remained perfectly blank. "You have been tracking my flights." "It is an occupational habit." DeAndre shrugged casually. "As a pilot, I always check the international manifests when someone I know goes off the grid." "You have been busy, Isla. You have been tracing the money. The money Connor claims you stole before the divorce." I stepped closer to him, the tension between us turning razor sharp. "Connor is a pathological liar. I did not take a single dime from his startup. I went overseas to find out where the millions of dollars from his venture capital firm actually went. I went to find the blood money paying for that ice sculpture and that custom Vera Wang dress." "I know," DeAndre said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He glanced over my shoulder, scanning the manicured lawns to ensure we were entirely alone. The sudden shift in his demeanor caught me off guard. The calm, observant peacekeeper was gone. In his place was a man vibrating with barely suppressed rage. He set his bourbon glass down on the high-top table between us. He pulled a crisp white cocktail napkin from the bar and slid it across the marble surface. "Connor is a parasite." DeAndre said, his words clipped and precise. "He thinks he is the smartest guy in Silicon Valley, but he is just reckless. 2 weeks ago, I received a highly classified alert from the Federal Aviation Administration regarding my security clearance." I frowned, leaning in closer. "Why would your clearance be flagged?" DeAndre slid his hand over the cocktail napkin. "Because Connor needed a clean name with 0 financial red flags to act as the primary shareholder for his latest offshore shell company. He used my name, Isla. He forged my signature and used my spotless military and aviation background to open accounts in the Caymans. He risked my entire career, my federal clearance, and my freedom just to hide his stolen investor funds." My breath caught in my throat. Using a family member's identity to construct a fraudulent offshore entity was a federal crime carrying massive prison time. Connor had crossed a line so dangerous it bordered on absolute insanity. DeAndre lifted his hand from the table. Sitting squarely in the center of the white napkin was a tiny metallic micro USB drive. I managed to mirror his laptop hard drive to this flash drive while he was giving his rehearsal dinner speech last night. DeAndre whispered, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute lethal intent. The password is the date of your wedding anniversary. I know you have the missing puzzle pieces from your trip overseas. This drive contains the rest. Take it. I stared at the tiny piece of metal. It was the smoking gun. It was the digital key that would bypass months of legal subpoenas and crack Connor's fraudulent empire wide open. Tonight, I want to watch his empire burn. DeAndre said, his voice completely devoid of mercy. I reached out and smoothly palmed the USB drive, slipping it into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I looked up at DeAndre, a silent pact forming between us. We were no longer just in-laws. We were executioners. Before I could speak, a shadow fell over the marble table. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a cold, familiar voice slithered through the warm autumn air directly behind me. What exactly did you just hand her, DeAndre? Connor slammed his hand down on the marble table, trapping the white cocktail napkin under his heavy palm. He leaned between DeAndre and me, his expensive cologne failing to mask the sour scent of his rising panic. He snatched the napkin up, crumpling it in his fist, completely blind to the fact that my right hand was already resting comfortably inside my blazer pocket. My fingers were curled tightly around the cold metal of the micro USB drive. I asked you a question, Connor snapped, glaring directly at DeAndre. What are you two whispering about in the dark corners of my wedding? DeAndre did not even blink. He took another slow sip of his bourbon, his posture entirely relaxed. Just catching up with an old friend, Connor. Is there a law against making small talk at this $2 million circus? Connor tossed the crumpled napkin aside when he realized it was completely blank. He looked between us, his eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. He hated not being the smartest person in the room, and he hated it even more when he felt excluded from a conversation. He opened his mouth to press the issue further, but suddenly stopped. He noticed the gaze of several high-profile venture capitalists lingering on our tense standoff from across the patio. Like flipping a switch, his entire demeanor transformed. The aggressive, paranoid ex-husband vanished in an instant. In his place stood Connor, the benevolent billionaire, the magnanimous groom. He smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo and plastered on a smile so bright and fake it could have blinded the front row. He stepped back, creating physical space to ensure the surrounding guests had a clear view of his impending performance. Isla, Connor said, raising his voice just enough to carry over the gentle hum of the string quartet. I am actually glad you decided to show up today. It shows tremendous growth on your part. I know the last 6 months must have been incredibly difficult for you to process. He reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. A collective hush fell over the nearby crowd. They loved a spectacle, and Connor was determined to give them a legendary one. I know your modest little accounting job does not pay much, Connor continued, uncapping a heavy gold fountain pen. And flying back from whatever cheap European hostel you have been hiding in must have completely drained your meager savings. I do not want any bad blood between us, Isla. I really just want you to be okay. He scribbled quickly across the paper, the scratch of the pen echoing in the sudden quiet of the stone patio. He tore the check from the booklet with a sharp flick of his wrist and held it out to me. $10,000, Connor announced, his chest swelling with self-manufactured pride. Call it a severance bonus. Get yourself a nice apartment back in the city. Buy some clothes that actually fit your current lifestyle. Use it to start over and finally move on from the past. I looked at the slip of paper fluttering in his outstretched hand. The sheer audacity of the gesture was almost impressive in its cruelty. He wanted me to take his pity money in front of his wealthy investors, cementing his status as the generous victor and my role as the pathetic, discarded loser. You see, Connor proclaimed, stepping even closer so the crowd could catch his every word. Brittany and I are closing on a $5 million oceanfront mansion in Malibu next week. It has floor-to-ceiling glass, a private beach, and a wine cellar larger than the cramped apartment we used to share. It is exactly the kind of lavish life I always told you I would build. The kind of life you told me was too risky to pursue because you lacked the vision to see my true potential. He let out a condescending chuckle, looking around to gather nods of approval from his sycophants in the crowd. He was trying to crush my spirit by parading the exact fantasy he had denied me. I am moving forward, Isla. I am building an empire, Connor said, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. And while I cannot bring you with me to the top, I can at least make sure you do not starve at the bottom. Take the check. DeAndre shifted his weight next to me, his jaw clenching tight, but I gave him a subtle shake of my head. I did not need him to intervene. I reached out and took the check from Connor. A collective murmur rippled through the onlookers. They actually thought I had folded. They thought the poor, desperate ex-wife was going to accept the humiliating handout. Connor turned slightly toward his tech buddies, ready to accept their silent praise for his flawless display of dominance. I held the check up, examining his rushed, arrogant signature. Then, with deliberate and agonizingly slow precision, I gripped the top edge and tore the thick paper straight down the middle. The sharp, ripping sound sliced through the ambient noise of the wedding reception. Connor whipped his head back around his victorious smirk, freezing in place. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing his grand $10,000 gesture into worthless confetti. I let the pieces flutter from my fingers, watching them drift down to the cobblestones to land directly on top of the wine stain Brittany had left on my shoes. A Malibu mansion, I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence like a surgical scalpel. That is incredibly impressive, Connor. Oceanfront property is always a solid investment strategy. I stepped directly into his personal space, watching the confident light in his eyes begin to flicker and die. I just hope you read the fine print on the frozen asset clause. I continued, keeping my tone conversational, but lethal. You know, the clause that automatically activates the moment the federal government realizes you illegally used your mother's pension fund as collateral to secure the mortgage. Connor stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. His eyes darted frantically to the crowd, terrified that someone had understood the financial terminology I had just weaponized against him. I have no idea what you are talking about, he choked out, but the violent tremor in his voice betrayed him completely. Oh, I think you do, I whispered, leaning in closer. You really should have hired a better accountant before you started playing games with federal banking regulations. Enjoy the rest of your reception, Connor. Connor stood paralyzed on the cobblestones. The color had completely vanished from his arrogant face, leaving him looking like a terrified child. I did not wait for his carefully constructed reality to shatter. I turned on my heel, the ruined suede of my shoes making a soft scraping sound against the stone. Before I could take 3 steps, a manicured hand clamped down on my wrist. It was not a groomsman this time. It was Sydney. Connor's older sister and DeAndre's wife wore a pale pink bridesmaid dress and an expression of manufactured sympathy that looked utterly foreign on her sharp features. Isla, please, Sydney said, her voice hushed and urgently sweet. This is getting completely out of hand. Connor is just stressed about the wedding and you are clearly hurting. Let us just step inside for a minute. Just us girls. We can talk this out and call a truce. I do not want security dragging you out in front of the press. I looked at Sydney's gripping fingers. I knew better than to trust a single member of the Thorne family, but I also knew I needed a few minutes away from the crowded courtyard to access a secure terminal. DeAndre's USB drive was burning a hole in my pocket. I needed to verify the data immediately. Led the way, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Sydney offered a tight, relieved smile and pulled me away from the champagne tower. We navigated through a labyrinth of imported rose bushes until we reached the massive, ornate double doors of the estate's master bridal suite. Sydney pushed the door open and ushered me inside. The moment my feet crossed the threshold, the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind me. The distinct click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the cavernous room. I turned around. The truce was exactly what I expected. A trap. The bridal suite was a grotesque monument to Brittany's vanity. Racks of designer dresses lined the walls, and dozens of empty champagne flutes littered the antique furniture. Standing in the center of the plush Persian rug flanked by full-length mirrors were Brenda and Brittany. Their arms were crossed and their faces were twisted into identical masks of absolute hatred. "You actually thought you could walk in here and threaten my son?" Brenda snarled, her voice vibrating with a vicious protective rage. "You psychotic little thief!" I stood perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust to the bright vanity lights illuminating the room. "Thief?" I asked, tilting my head. "That is a fascinating choice of words, Brenda. Do not play innocent with us." Isla, Brittany snapped, stepping forward. Her wedding gown rustled heavily against the floorboards. "Connor told us everything. We know exactly why you fled to Europe after the divorce." Sydney walked past me to stand shoulder to shoulder with her mother and the new bride. "We know about the $2 million, Isla," Sydney said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Connor showed us the financial discrepancies. He showed us how you manipulated the accounting software at his startup to funnel investor capital into your own private accounts overseas." The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Connor had not just hidden the stolen money. He had built a firewall of lies to protect himself from his own family. He knew the investors would eventually notice the missing capital. Instead of covering his tracks, he had proactively framed me. He had gaslit his mother, his sister, and his new wife into believing the bitter ex-wife had embezzled the funds out of sheer spite. He used my sudden trip to Europe, a trip I took specifically to track his fraudulent offshore accounts, as proof of my guilt. "He told you I stole the money," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "And you believed him?" "Of course we believed him," Brenda shouted, taking a step closer. "You were the only one with the financial access to move those funds. He had to divorce you to protect the company. He spent the last 6 months working around the clock to replace the capital you drained from his life. And you have the nerve to stand outside and accuse him of using my pension fund as collateral. You are sick." I looked at Brenda. The absolute conviction in her eyes was almost tragic. She had handed over her life savings to her son, believing she was helping him recover from my imaginary crimes. Connor had weaponized their trust to fund his illegal empire. "You are pathetic," Isla Brittany added, lifting her chin. "Connor warned me you might try to extort us today. He said you were obsessed, but you are not getting another dime from him." While they hurled their rehearsed insults, my eyes scanned the perimeter of the opulent suite. My gaze locked onto the massive, lighted makeup vanity against the far wall. Sitting directly beneath the bright bulbs was Connor's personal iPad Pro. The screen was illuminated and unlocked actively, playing a soft jazz playlist through the suite's integrated sound system. It was the exact piece of hardware I needed. Connor's devices were automatically synced to his corporate cloud servers. I let out a shaky breath, deliberately dropping my shoulders to feign defeat. I took a slow, stumbling step backward, as if their accusations had physically struck me. I let my back hit the edge of the makeup vanity, gripping the marble countertop to steady myself. "You all actually think I took the money," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured emotion. I let my left hand cover my face in a portrait of despair. Simultaneously, my right hand slipped into my blazer pocket. My fingers grasped the tiny micro USB drive DeAndre had given me. Operating entirely by touch, I slid my hand along the edge of the iPad. "We do not think it, Isla, we know it," Brenda said, her voice rising to a triumphant shriek. "And if you do not leave this property in the next 60 seconds, I am calling the police and having you arrested for grand larceny." I found the charging port. With a swift, silent motion, I pushed the USB drive into the slot. I dropped my left hand from my face and casually rested it on the iPad screen. A prompt appeared asking to authenticate the external drive. I tapped Allow. A progress bar instantly materialized, initiating the silent data transfer of DeAndre's mirrored files directly into my secure encrypted cloud network. "You are not going to call the police, Brenda?" I said, my voice suddenly losing all trace of weakness. I stood up straight, towering over the vanity. The progress bar hit 30%. "Because if you call the authorities, they are going to ask for the audit trails." I continued, locking eyes with my former mother-in-law. "They are going to trace the missing $2 million, and they are not going to find it in my bank accounts." 50%. They are going to find it sitting in a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under DeAndre's name. A company Connor opened using forged signatures. Sydney gasped, taking a step back. What did you just say about my husband? 80%. I said your brother is a parasite, Sydney. He did not just steal from his investors. He framed me. He robbed your mother blind, and he set up your husband to take the fall for federal fraud. 100%. Transfer complete. I smoothly pulled the USB drive from the iPad and slipped it back into my pocket before anyone could process my movement. Brittany let out a furious scream, her face turning a mottled red. You are lying. You are a jealous lying. Before Brittany could finish her sentence, the heavy wooden doors of the bridal suite burst open with a violent crash. Connor stood in the doorway, his tuxedo jacket completely unbuttoned and his chest heaving as he gasped for air. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror as he stared directly at me. Connor stood frozen in the doorway of the bridal suite, his chest heaving under his custom tuxedo jacket. The blood had completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His eyes darted frantically from the illuminated screen of his iPad on the vanity to my perfectly calm expression, calculating exactly what he had just interrupted. Connor, thank God you were here, Brenda snapped, marching toward her son. This deranged woman broke into the suite. Have your groomsmen drag her out to the street immediately. Connor did not move. He did not issue a command. He just kept staring at me, his jaw working silently as a single drop of sweat rolled down his temple. He knew. He knew I had just breached the digital fortress he spent the last 6 months building. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer and stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I did not break eye contact as I walked smoothly past him, pausing just an inch from his ear. Enjoy the ceremony, Connor, I whispered, keeping my voice so low only he could hear it. Try not to trip over your lies on the way down the aisle. I slipped through the heavy wooden doors and walked back out into the California sunshine. Behind me, I could hear Brittany demanding to know why Connor looked like he had just seen a ghost, followed by the frantic voice of a wedding planner announcing it was time to line up for the procession. The ceremony took place in a breathtaking glass-enclosed conservatory on the edge of the vineyard. Towering floral arches of white orchids framed the aisle, and hundreds of gold chivari chairs were arranged in perfect symmetrical rows. I walked into the venue fully intending to find a quiet seat in the back, but Brenda was right on my heels. She grabbed my elbow, her manicured nails digging sharply into my fabric. You are not sitting with the guests, Brenda hissed, marching me forcefully past the last row of chairs. You want to stay and watch my son win. Then you are going to sit exactly where you belong. She shoved me toward a single folding metal chair shoved into the far back corner of the conservatory. It was positioned directly next to the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. The heavy scent of roasted lamb and truffle oil poured out of the kitchen, accompanied by the loud, chaotic clattering of silver trays and shouting chefs. It was the ultimate insult, a deliberate attempt to reduce me to the status of the hired help, completely isolated from the glittering wealth of the wedding party. I sat down on the cold metal chair and crossed my legs, resting my hands in my lap. I offered Brenda a serene, unbothered smile. Thank you for the VIP seating, Brenda. I have a feeling this is going to be the best view in the house. She sneered at me one last time before marching proudly up the center aisle to take her place in the front row. The string quartet began to play a sweeping classical piece, signaling the start of the ceremony. Connor walked down the aisle first. He looked entirely different from the arrogant billionaire who had offered me a $10,000 pity check just 20 minutes ago. His posture was rigid. He kept wiping his palms against his tuxedo trousers, and his eyes twitched nervously, scanning the back of the room until they locked onto me sitting by the kitchen doors. I raised my chin and held his gaze. He swallowed hard and quickly looked away. As the bridesmaids filed in, followed by Brittany in her sparkling Vera Wang gown, I pulled my phone from my pocket. The cloud synchronization was complete. The encrypted files from Connor's iPad were fully downloaded and ready for review. I lowered the brightness on my screen and began to read. At the altar, the officiant welcomed the guests and invited Connor to say a few words before the traditional vows. Connor took a microphone, clearing his throat, as he looked out over the sea of investors, tech executives, and wealthy socialites. "Brittany, you have shown me what true partnership means," Connor began, his voice echoing through the conservatory. "When I started my company, I built an empire on trust, transparency, and a commitment to building a better future." I swiped open the first financial ledger on my screen. It was a master document detailing the initial venture capital funding for his tech startup. Right beside the $2 million deficit that Connor had publicly accused me of embezzling was a direct routing number. I traced the numbers with my thumb. The money had not vanished into my accounts. Connor had wired the exact amount to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a shell company registered entirely under the forged identity of DeAndre, his own brother-in-law. "Today, as a symbol of our new life together, I am pledging $1 million to the Thorne Family Foundation," Connor declared to the crowd, prompting a wave of enthusiastic applause from the front rows. Brenda beamed with pride, wiping a tear from her cheek. I opened the folder labeled Thorne Family Foundation. It was not a charity, it was a dummy corporation. Connor had been quietly siphoning money from the foundation to cover his massive gambling debts in Macau, the same debts that funded Brittany's counterfeit vintage watch, and the $5 million Malibu mansion he had bragged about. I pulled up the loan origination documents. The property was heavily leveraged against Brenda Thorne's entire corporate pension fund. He had forged his own mother's signature to use her retirement savings as collateral for a house she did not even know he bought. He was not a billionaire. He was a house of cards drowning in federal fraud, and he had tied a concrete block around the ankles of every single family member who blindly supported him. I looked up from my screen. DeAndre was standing in the front row with the other groomsmen. He slowly turned his head and caught my eye. I gave him a single definitive nod. We had everything we needed. The officiant took the microphone back from Connor, his voice booming over the sound system. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Connor and Brittany. Marriage is a foundation of truth and absolute honesty." Connor wiped another drop of sweat from his forehead. He looked sick. The color was draining from his face as he stared at the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the venue, completely ignoring his beaming bride. Therefore, the officiant continued, his voice dropping to a solemn register. "If anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." The conservatory fell silent. The string quartet paused. The only sound was the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen behind me. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I did not need to raise my hand. I did not need to shout an objection. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the venue crashed open with a violent echoing bang. The heavy mahogany doors reverberated against the stone walls of the conservatory like a gunshot. The afternoon sunlight poured through the entryway, casting a long, imposing shadow down the center of the pristine white aisle. Standing perfectly still in the threshold was a man the Silicon Valley elite had not seen in 2 years. Vincent Caldwell. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the hundreds of seated guests. Champagne flutes paused halfway to parted lips. The venture capitalists in the front rows shifted uncomfortably in their gold chivalry chairs, murmuring in shocked disbelief. They all recognized the ghost of Silicon Valley. They all knew the man who had supposedly disgraced his own legacy. I remained seated in my metal chair by the kitchen doors, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spreading across my face. I had been waiting for this exact moment. At the altar, Connor stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. The microphone emitted a harsh, whining feedback loop as his grip on it tightened. His face instantly drained of all color, transforming from a flushed, arrogant groom into a chalk-white portrait of absolute terror. He looked wildly around the room, his chest heaving, his meticulously crafted composure shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "Security!" Connor shrieked into the microphone, the sound blasting through the conservatory speakers and causing the guests to flinch. "Get him out of here. Guards, remove this man immediately. He is a trespasser. He is a convicted felon." Vincent did not flinch at the shouting. He was 55 years old, his hair entirely silver, his face weathered by the relentless stress of the past 24 months. He wore a simple, unbranded suit that starkly contrasted with the $2 million excess surrounding him. But his posture was unyielding. He carried the quiet, dangerous authority of a man who had already lost everything and had absolutely nothing left to fear. Vincent took a slow, deliberate step down the aisle. The pristine white orchids framing the walkway seemed to tremble as he passed. "You thought I would stay buried forever, Connor?" Vincent's voice was raw, echoing through the cavernous glass room without the need for a microphone. "You thought you could build your glittering empire on the ashes of my life and I would just quietly disappear into the dark." Connor pointed a shaking finger at the aisle. "Security. I pay you people to protect this estate. Grab him right now." Brittany clutched her massive Vera Wang skirt, her heavily contoured face twisting in confusion and panic. "Connor, what is going on?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Who is this old man ruining our wedding?" Brenda shot up from her front row seat, her face purple with outrage. "How dare you barge in here?" she screamed at Vincent. "You ruined my son's first company. You stole from him. You are a disgrace." Vincent let out a dark, humorless laugh that silenced Brenda instantly. "I did not steal a single dime, Brenda. Your brilliant son framed me." I watched Connor's knees actually buckle slightly. This was the dark, rotting core of the Thorne family empire. 2 years ago, Vincent had been Connor's mentor. He was the original genius behind the algorithm that launched their first tech startup. He had treated Connor like a son, welcoming him into the business, giving him a massive equity stake and trusting him completely. And Connor had repaid that loyalty with a knife to the back. When the startup's funding began to hemorrhage, Connor panicked. Instead of admitting his reckless mismanagement, he manipulated the corporate ledgers. He planted offshore accounts in Vincent's name, forged digital signatures, and tipped off the federal regulators himself. Connor ruthlessly orchestrated a raid that ended with Vincent taking the fall for corporate fraud. The scandal bankrupted Vincent, stripped him of his shares, and left Connor as the sole untarnished CEO of a massive tech windfall. That was the exact moment my marriage truly ended. The infidelity, the arrogance, the lies, those were symptoms. But discovering the buried audit trails late one night in Connor's home office, realizing that the man I slept next to was a sociopath, willing to destroy his own mentor to save himself. That was the absolute catalyst. I filed for divorce the very next morning. Connor told the world I was just a jealous, bitter woman. He had no idea I spent the last 2 years quietly gathering the breadcrumbs of his crimes to hand directly to Vincent. 4 private security guards in dark suits burst from the side doors of the conservatory. They sprinted down the side aisles, moving to intercept Vincent before he could reach the altar. Connor let out a breath of relief, a cruel, desperate smirk returning to his face. "Drag him out to the curb," Connor commanded, his voice dripping with venom again. "Throw him to the press." The guards reached the center aisle, raising their hands to grab Vincent's shoulders. But they suddenly froze. They did not touch him. Instead, all 4 men turned their heads toward the front of the room, looking for the final authorization. DeAndre stepped smoothly out of the groomsmen lineup. As the head of security for the entire event, his word was absolute law. He stood at the edge of the altar, his broad shoulders squared, his face an impenetrable mask of calm resolve. Connor turned to his brother-in-law, his eyes wide with frantic urgency. "DeAndre, what are they waiting for? Give the order. Get this trash out of my wedding." DeAndre looked at Connor. He looked at the panic sweating through the groom's expensive tuxedo. He thought about the Cayman Island accounts opened in his name, the federal crimes Connor had pinned on him, without a second thought. DeAndre slowly turned his gaze back to the security team. He gave a single sharp shake of his head. "Stand down," DeAndre ordered, his deep baritone voice carrying absolute authority. "Let the man speak." Connor gasped, stumbling backward as if DeAndre had driven a physical blade into his chest. He looked frantically between his brother-in-law, the retreating security guards, and the approaching figure of his former mentor. He was completely stripped of his armor, exposed, and entirely alone. The security guards immediately stepped back, folding their hands behind their backs and clearing the path. Vincent did not break his stride. He walked straight up the short flight of stairs to the altar, his eyes locked onto the man who had destroyed his life. He stepped directly into Connor's personal space, radiating a quiet, terrifying power. Connor was too paralyzed by shock to even raise his hands in defense. Vincent reached out firmly, wrapping his fingers around the microphone and pulled it effortlessly from Connor's trembling grip. The screech of audio feedback pierced the conservatory as Vincent gripped the microphone, the sharp metallic whine forcing several guests in the front rows to cover their ears. He did not tap it to test the sound. He did not offer a polite introduction. He simply locked his eyes onto Connor, who was currently trembling so violently that the boutonniere pinned to his lapel vibrated. "Connor, you always did love big numbers," Vincent said. His voice was remarkably steady, a low, authoritative rumble that resonated off the high glass walls and settled heavily over the 300 guests. "You love valuations. You love to talk about scaling exponential growth and disrupting the market. So let us talk about a very specific number today. Let us talk about $14.5 million. A collective sharp intake of breath rippled through the front rows. The venture capitalists, the very men and women who had funded Connor's meteoric rise, suddenly sat up perfectly straight. Their champagne flutes were lowered. That number meant something to them. "That is the exact amount of capital you siphoned from our Series B investors." Vincent continued, taking a slow step toward the center of the altar. "You funneled it through a network of shell companies and dumped it directly into unregulated crypto accounts. Accounts controlled entirely by you." Brittany let out a strangled gasp. She looked at her new husband with wide, horrified eyes, instinctively taking a step away from him. Her massive white gown rustled loudly against the stone floor, the only sound in the dead silence of the room. "And Brittany," Vincent added, turning his gaze toward the bride with a look of cold, clinical pity. "That custom 10-carat flawless diamond currently sitting on your left hand. You might want to get that appraised, because it was paid for with the exact funds Connor stole from the people sitting in this very room." Brittany shrieked, clutching her left hand to her chest as if the ring had suddenly caught fire. She clawed at her finger, trying to pull the heavy diamond off, but it was stuck. Her screams snapped Connor out of his paralyzed state. The illusion of the untouchable billionaire shattered completely. He lunged forward like a cornered animal, waving his hands frantically to silence the room. "Shut up!" Connor roared, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "Cut his microphone right now. He is a liar!" Connor turned to the audience, throwing his arms wide in a desperate, sweating plea for control. "Do not listen to a word this man says. Look at him. Look at what he has become. Vincent is a delusional, bitter drunk. He ran his own finances into the ground. He bankrupted himself 2 years ago because he lacked the vision to keep up with the market, and now he is trying to ruin my wedding out of pure, pathetic spite." Vincent did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to argue. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his cheap suit and pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers. "I have the ledger," Vincent said quietly, holding the papers up for the front row to see. "The real one. The one you thought you wiped from the servers the night you tipped off the feds and framed me." Connor scrambled backward, his eyes darting wildly around the conservatory. He could see the expressions on the faces of his investors. They were not laughing at Vincent. They were not dismissing him as a bitter drunk. They were listening. Some were already pulling out their phones, their thumbs flying across screens to contact their legal teams. Connor was losing the room. He was losing his empire. He needed a distraction, and he needed it immediately. He needed a scapegoat. His frantic gaze swept over the sea of angry faces, zooming past the floral arrangements and the stunned bridesmaids until it locked directly onto me. I was sitting exactly where his mother had forced me to sit, banished to the folding metal chair by the kitchen doors. A twisted, desperate light ignited in Connor's eyes. He saw his lifeline. "He is lying," Connor shrieked, pointing a shaking finger straight down the center aisle at me. "He is protecting the real thief." "She did it." The crowd gasped again, a wave of confusion washing over the room. "Isla stole the money," Connor yelled, stepping down from the altar to ensure every single person heard his accusation. "My ex-wife. She was the lead accountant for our startup. She had the access codes. She had the security credentials. She manipulated the software to drain those accounts and frame Vincent to cover her tracks. Brenda jumped up from her seat in the front row, sensing the shift in momentum and eagerly jumping on the attack. "It is true," Brenda yelled to the crowd, her face twisted with vindictive fury. "She is a criminal. We have the proof in the bridal suite right now. Why do you think we got divorced?" Connor continued, his voice growing louder, feeding on his own manufactured conviction. "I caught her. I tried to handle it internally to protect the company. I tried to be merciful. But she took the $14.5 million and fled to Europe to hide. She lived in cheap hostels to lay low while the heat died down. And now she has the absolute nerve to show up at my wedding to extort me for more." 300 heads turned in perfect unison. 300 pairs of eyes locked onto me. The Silicon Valley elite, the wealthy socialites, the former in-laws who had spent years making me feel completely worthless. They all glared at me, their faces hardened with judgment and disgust. The silence in the conservatory was heavy, oppressive, and suffocating. They expected me to break. They expected the humiliated, disgraced ex-wife to burst into tears, cover her face to hide her shame, and flee out the kitchen doors into the parking lot. They expected me to run. I did not run. I looked at Connor, seeing the terrified, pathetic boy hiding behind his bespoke tuxedo and his mountain of lies. I placed my hands on my knees and pushed myself up from the cold metal chair. The sound of the metal legs scraping against the stone floor echoed like a gunshot. I stood tall, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the micro USB drive resting in my pocket. I reached up and calmly, deliberately straightened the lapels of my blazer. Then, ignoring the gasps and the hostile whispers rippling through the crowd, I stepped out from the shadows of the back row. I kept my eyes locked dead onto Connor, and I began a slow, deliberate walk straight down the center aisle toward the altar. The clicking of my heels against the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a metronome, counting down the final seconds of Connor's life. 300 pairs of eyes followed my every movement. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch, forcing the venture capitalists, the socialites, and the Thorne family to sit in the suffocating tension of their own making. I reached the base of the altar. Vincent stood to the side, his silver hair catching the California sun, his expression one of grim satisfaction. Connor, however, was unraveling. The polished veneer of the tech visionary had completely melted away, leaving a cornered, sweating fraud. As I placed my foot on the first step, Connor broke. He lunged forward, his face contorted in an ugly, primal rage, raising both hands to physically shove me back down the stairs. "Get her out of here," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. Before his hands could even graze my blazer, a solid wall of custom-tailored fabric stepped between us. DeAndre. He moved with the terrifying speed of a man half his size, planting his feet firmly on the stairs and catching Connor by the lapels of his tuxedo. DeAndre did not throw a punch. He did not yell. He simply gripped Connor with enough force to lift him slightly off his toes and shoved him backward. "Do not touch her." DeAndre said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that carried no trace of his usual easygoing charm. "You take one more step toward her, Connor, and I will let these investors handle you themselves." Connor stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the marble, before Brittany grabbed his arm to steady him. She was shaking, her eyes darting between me, DeAndre, and the crowd of angry shareholders who were now standing up from their gold chivalry chairs. Vincent stepped forward and held out the microphone. I took it, feeling the cold, heavy metal ground me. I turned to face the sea of elite guests. "Connor just told you an incredibly compelling story." I began, keeping my voice steady, conversational, and lethal. "He told you I was a bitter, jealous accountant. He told you I exploited my access to his startup, drained $14.5 million from your investments, and ran away to Europe in shame." I paced slowly across the altar, forcing Connor to shrink back against the floral archway. What my ex-husband conveniently left out is my actual profession. I continued, my gaze sweeping over the front rows where the lead investors sat. "I am not a standard bookkeeper. I am a forensic corporate auditor. I specialize in tracking deliberately obfuscated assets across international borders." A sharp murmur swept through the crowd. I saw 3 different venture capitalists immediately pull out their phones, their thumbs hovering over their screens. I did not flee to Switzerland and the Cayman Islands to hide, I said, turning my attention directly to Brenda, who was now clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the strand looked ready to snap. I did not stay in cheap hostels. I sat in secure bank offices in Geneva. I met with federal regulators in Grand Cayman. I went there to physically trace the serial numbers, the IP addresses, and the encrypted routing protocols of Connor's offshore accounts. Connor let out a panicked, strangled noise. She is fabricating this. She has absolutely no proof. It is a desperate smear campaign. I ignored him, keeping my focus on the people who had actually funded his lies. When Connor realized his gross mismanagement was going to bankrupt his first company, he panicked. But instead of facing his investors, he created a scapegoat. He framed Vincent. He forged digital authorizations to make it look like his mentor was siphoning the funds. And then he used that stolen $14.5 million to launch this new empire. He used your money to buy his Malibu mansion, to fund his mother's dummy charitable foundation, and to purchase the massive diamond currently sitting on his bride's finger. Brittany let out a loud sob, burying her face in her hands. He thought because he wiped his local servers the money was untraceable, I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through the rising chaos in the room. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, but forensic auditing is not about looking at what is there. It is about finding the negative space. It is about finding the shadows where the money used to be. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The venue was equipped with 2 massive state-of-the-art LED screens flanking the altar, currently displaying a paused, elegant monogram of Connor and Brittany's initials. They had been set up to play a romantic montage of their heavily curated relationship. During my brief detour to the bridal suite earlier, I had not just downloaded the mirrored files from Connor's iPad. I had also taken a moment to sync my device to the venue's casting network. Connor saw the phone in my hand. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. No, he gasped, taking a weak step forward before DeAndre shot him a warning glare that froze him in place. Do not let her connect to the network. Turn the screens off. But the audiovisual technicians at the back of the room were not moving. They were staring at me just as captivated as the rest of the room. You all came here today to celebrate a union, I said, tapping the screen of my phone. You came here to watch a beautiful presentation of Connor's success. I pressed the casting icon. The massive LED screens flanking the altar flickered for a fraction of a second. The elegant monogram vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, high-resolution image of a Cayman Islands bank ledger, completely unredacted, showing a direct wire transfer from the startup's primary holding account. Let us look at the wedding slideshow, shall we? The 20-foot LED screens flickered the soft ambient backlighting, instantly replaced by the harsh, glaring white of scanned financial documents. There were no pictures of Connor and Brittany laughing on a yacht. There was no montage of their perfectly curated romance. Instead, towering above the altar was a masterclass in forensic accounting. I swiped my thumb across my phone screen, and the presentation transitioned to the next slide. A collective gasp, sharper and much louder than before, tore through the conservatory. On the left side of the screen sat the original Series B funding ledger, the lifeblood of the startup that these very investors had provided. On the right side was the exact matching withdrawal. $14.5 million. I tracked the serial numbers of the initial seed capital through 3 different international borders. I said, my voice projecting clearly over the rising murmur of the crowd. I highlighted the routing numbers in bright red. The line traced directly from the company's primary holding account into a dummy corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Horizon Ventures, LLC. He did not just wire it, he broke it into microtransactions, a classic laundering technique bypassing standard banking flags. He converted it to Ethereum, bounced it through decentralized exchanges, and deposited it into blind trusts. Connor lunged for the audio-visual cables taped to the side of the altar, but DeAndre simply shifted his weight, blocking the groom's path with an immovable stance. Connor was trapped, forced to watch his own execution broadcast in high definition. I swiped to the next slide. This one was a side-by-side forensic analysis of a signature. Connor told the board that Vincent authorized the transfer, I said, pointing to the screens. He presented a signed executive order. Look at the screen. On the left is Vincent's actual signature from his employment contract. On the right is the authorization form. If you look at the pressure points and the pixelation artifacts, you can see it is a direct digital trace. Connor did not even bother to hire a professional forger. He used basic design software to copy and paste his mentor's signature to steal millions. The murmurs in the front rows erupted into outright shouting. These were not people accustomed to losing. They were the apex predators of Silicon Valley, and they had just realized they were the prey. A man in a Tom Ford tuxedo, whom I recognized as the lead partner at the venture capital firm that had funded Connor's seed round, stood up so fast his gold chair crashed backward onto the marble floor. "Are you kidding me?" the investor roared, pulling his phone from his breast pocket. He turned to the man sitting next to him, his face purple with rage. "He used our capital to buy a shell company. Call legal right now. Get a freeze on everything." I swiped again, maintaining a relentless pace. The screen shifted to a flowchart of the offshore accounts. The stolen funds were mapped out, showing the exact moment the money was deposited, right back into domestic accounts. And whose accounts were they, I asked the crowd. I tapped the screen. The names materialized in massive bold letters. Connor's personal accounts, his mother Brenda's private trust. Brenda let out a sound like a dying animal. Her face lost its arrogant purple flush, draining to a sickly, terrifying pale. The woman who had just called me a thief was now staring at the undeniable proof that her own son had used her as a money-laundering mule. She covered her face with her expensive clutch purse as the guests around her physically leaned away, treating her like a sudden contagion. "Let us look at where your investment capital actually went," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, contrasting the absolute hysteria breaking out in the room. $2.5 million for the down payment on the Malibu estate, $800,000 funneled into Brenda's fake charitable foundation, and of course the wedding we are currently attending. The screen displayed the invoice for the custom 10-carat diamond ring. Next to it was the deposit receipt for the conservatory, the catering, and the imported white orchids. "You are not drinking to the success of a brilliant tech visionary today," I told the crowd. "You are drinking champagne paid for by your own stolen money." Complete pandemonium broke out. Dozens of high-profile investors were now on their feet. Men and women in formal wear were screaming into their cell phones, shouting demands to freeze assets, contact the Securities and Exchange Commission, and dispatch corporate lawyers to Connor's headquarters. Voices overlapped in a cacophony of frantic directives. The elegant wedding had transformed into a hostile corporate takeover right on the altar. Connor was hyperventilating. He backed away from DeAndre, retreating until his back hit the glass wall of the conservatory. He tugged frantically at his bow tie, ripping it loose as if it were choking him. He had no charm left, no smooth-talking pitch to get out of this. The proof was 20 feet tall and glowing right above his head. Vincent stood motionless, watching the boy he had treated like a son crumble into absolute ruin. Vincent did not gloat. He just watched a silent sentinel of justice finally served. Brittany, however, was in a state of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at the screen, then at the screaming investors, and finally at the man she was supposed to marry. The reality of the situation crashed down on her. The billionaire lifestyle, the Malibu mansion, the private jets, it was all a mirage built on stolen cash. She picked up the heavy skirts of her Vera Wang gown and scrambled off the altar, nearly tripping over her own train. She bypassed Connor entirely, not even casting him a second glance. Instead, she sprinted toward the side of the room where her wedding planner, a sharp-looking woman with a headset and a clipboard, was frantically tapping on an iPad. "Get me out of here!" Brittany shrieked at the planner, her heavy bridal makeup running down her face. "Cancel the reception! Cancel the string quartet! Order my car right now! I am leaving!" The wedding planner did not look up from her screen. Her face was entirely drained of color. She tapped her screen one more time, then slowly raised her eyes to meet the frantic bride. The planner held up her hand, a gesture that demanded immediate silence. She reached over to the soundboard beside her and keyed the secondary microphone channel, her voice broadcasting loud and clear over the ensuing chaos. "I am afraid I cannot order your car, ma'am," the wedding planner announced, her voice echoing sharply across the conservatory and cutting through the shouting investors. "And I cannot pay the catering staff or the florists or the venue hosts." Brittany stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth hanging open. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "We paid for everything. Run the cards again." The wedding planner shook her head, holding up the iPad for Brittany to see the glaring red error messages filling the screen. "I just did," the planner said loudly, ensuring every single guest heard the final nail in the coffin. "Ma'am, every single credit card you provided for the catering, the floral arrangements, and the venue deposit has just been declined." The wedding planner's announcement hung in the air like a guillotine dropping. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts immediately stopped serving. Trays of expensive champagne were set down on the nearest tables. The head caterer marched out from the swinging kitchen doors, shouting orders to his team to pack up the carving stations. The illusion of the $2 million wedding evaporated in real time. Brittany sank onto the nearest chair, hyperventilating as her mother rushed to her side, shielding her from the flashing cameras of the guests' smartphones. But Brenda Thorne could not accept defeat. She had spent her entire life curating an image of untouchable wealth and superiority. Her son was the golden boy of Silicon Valley. He was a visionary. He was a billionaire. He was not a common thief. Her reality was fracturing, and her mind violently rejected the evidence glowing on the 20-foot screens. Brenda let out a guttural, furious scream. She hiked up the hem of her emerald green designer gown and stormed past the paralyzed groomsmen. She charged directly at me, her eyes wild, her face flushed a dark, dangerous red. "You jealous witch!" Brenda shrieked, raising her hand high into the air. "You fabricated all of this because my son did not want you." She swung her arm with all her might, aiming an open-handed slap directly at my face, intending to knock the smartphone out of my grip. I did not flinch. I simply took a half-step backward. Brenda's hand sliced through empty air. The momentum of her missed strike spun her off balance, her expensive heels wobbling dangerously on the polished marble. DeAndre stepped forward to intervene, but I held up a single finger to stop him. I did not need security to handle Brenda Thorne. I stepped back into her line of sight, keeping my posture entirely relaxed. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysteria. "I did not fabricate a single pixel on those screens, Brenda," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. "And this has absolutely nothing to do with jealousy." I looked down at my phone. I swiped my thumb across the glass. The massive LED displays behind the altar flashed, leaving behind the offshore banking ledgers and replacing them with a brand new set of documents. "Look at the screen, Brenda," I commanded. Brenda blinked, her chest heaving as she turned her head. The anger drained from her face the instant she recognized the letterhead on the 20-foot display. It was the crest of her own personal wealth management firm. On the left side of the screen was a high-resolution scan of the original deed to the Thorne family ancestral estate. It was a sprawling historic property in Pacific Heights that had been in her family for 3 generations. It was Brenda's pride and joy. It was the physical manifestation of her old money status. On the right side of the screen was a commercial loan agreement. It was a massive high-interest line of credit. The collateral listed on the document was the Pacific Heights estate. "Connor did not just steal from his corporate investors," I explained, walking slowly around Brenda, forcing her to follow my voice as she stared up at the horrifying reality above her. "When the venture capital money ran out, when the offshore accounts were drained to pay for this wedding and his Malibu house, his shell company needed a sudden injection of cash to keep the fraudulent ledgers balanced. He needed capital, and he needed it from someone who would not ask questions." Brenda shook her head, taking a stumbling step backward. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, that property is held in an ironclad trust. It cannot be leveraged. It can be leveraged if the primary trustee signs off on it," I corrected her. I tapped my phone again. The screen zoomed in heavily on the signature line of the commercial loan agreement. There in sprawling black ink was Brenda Thorne's signature, or at least a perfect digital replica of it. He forged your signature, Brenda, I said, delivering the words with surgical precision. He used the exact same software trick he used to frame Vincent. He bypassed the trust protocols, circumvented your wealth manager, and used your ancestral home as direct collateral for his shell company. Brenda turned to look at Connor. Her golden boy was completely silent. He was pressing his back against the glass wall of the conservatory, refusing to meet his mother's eyes. He stared at the floor, his face pale and slick with sweat. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. But he did not stop at the house. I continued, refusing to give her a moment to catch her breath. I swiped the screen one final time. The display shifted to a series of wire transfers originating from Brenda's private retirement accounts. The destination was the same Cayman Island crypto exchange Connor had used to hide the investor funds. The balance on the retirement account, clearly visible in bold red numbers, was absolute zero. "He liquidated your entire portfolio," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "Every stock, every bond, every mutual fund you spent 40 years accumulating. He drained it to the last cent to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat for just a few more months." Brenda let out a soft, wheezing gasp. She looked from the screens to Connor and then back to the screens. The woman who had spent years treating me like a disposable peasant was now facing the total annihilation of her own existence. "The bank triggered the default protocols yesterday morning," I said, delivering the final fatal blow. "The foreclosure notices have already been filed. The accounts are completely empty. You have absolutely nothing left. You are officially homeless." The air seemed to leave Brenda's lungs all at once. Her knees buckled. The strength vanished from her legs and she collapsed hard onto the marble floor of the altar. She did not try to catch herself. She simply crumpled into a heap of emerald silk, staring blankly ahead, completely broken by the sun she had worshipped. Brenda Thorne remained crumpled on the marble floor, her emerald silk gown pulled around her like a deflated parachute. Connor did not reach down to help his mother. He did not even look at her. His frantic, bloodshot eyes were entirely fixated on Brittany, who was currently staring at him as if he had just transformed into a grotesque monster. The reality of the declined credit cards and the forged real estate deeds had finally penetrated the bride's panic. The massive Cayman Island bank statements glowing on the 20-foot screens above them were no longer just abstract numbers. They were an eviction notice. They were the absolute destruction of the lavish high society future she had meticulously secured for herself. Brittany's hands curled into tight fists at her sides. Her chest heaved, the intricate lace of her custom bodice straining with every jagged breath. Connor took a trembling step toward her, reaching out with both hands in a pathetic gesture of appeasement. "Brittany, please," Connor begged, his voice cracking into a high, reedy whine. "You have to listen to me. This is just a temporary setback. I can fix this. I can fix all of it." Brittany did not retreat. Instead, she closed the distance between them with a sudden vicious burst of speed. She raised her right hand and slapped Connor directly across the face. The impact cracked through the conservatory with the force of a bullwhip. Connor's head snapped to the side, a bright red handprint blooming instantly across his pale cheek. He staggered, completely caught off guard by the sheer physical power behind the blow. "You promised me a billionaire lifestyle!" Brittany shrieked, her voice tearing through the silent room. "You told me we were buying an island. You told me I would never have to look at a price tag for the rest of my life. And you dragged me into a massive federal fraud scheme. I am pregnant, you idiot." A collective gasp swept through the 300 guests. The venture capitalists in the front rows, still clutching their cell phones and glaring at the stage, suddenly recoiled. A pregnancy introduced an entirely new, incredibly messy dimension to the impending legal fallout. Connor's eyes widened to the point of bulging. He stared at Brittany's stomach, completely blindsided by the revelation. But his shock lasted only a fraction of a second before his survival instincts overrode everything else. He needed to keep her quiet. He needed to keep her on his side before she started talking to the inevitable swarm of federal investigators. Connor dropped to his knees right there on the altar. He ignored the gasps from his former friends. He ignored his mother whimpering on the floor beside him. He grabbed fistfuls of Brittany's heavy tulle skirt, burying his face in the fabric, as he looked up at her with desperate manic eyes. "I have money," Connor hissed, speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "I have hidden cash, Brittany. I knew the startup capital would not last forever. I am not stupid. I moved millions into decentralized cold storage wallets before the auditors even started looking. I have physical gold locked in a safety deposit box in Zurich. We do not need the Malibu house. We do not need the company. We can take the private jet tonight before the authorities freeze the flight logs. We can disappear and raise our child like royalty. I promise you." I stood a few feet away, watching him confess to secondary wire fraud and international money laundering on a hot stage in front of his entire board of directors. The sheer arrogance was staggering. He was so desperate to maintain his illusion of control that he was freely handing the venture capitalists the exact roadmap to recover their stolen assets. Brittany stared down at him, her expression hardening. The mention of untraceable millions made her hesitate. The furious red flush in her cheeks began to recede, replaced by the cold, calculating look of a woman weighing her survival options. She looked at the exit, then back at Connor, her mind racing through the logistics of fleeing the country. Before she could make a decision, a large, calloused hand gently took the microphone from my grip. I turned to see DeAndre stepping up beside me. The head of security and the man who was supposed to be Connor's closest confidant looked down at the groom with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. DeAndre had watched Connor throw his mentor under the bus. He had watched Connor bankrupt his own mother. He had listened to Connor confess to hiding millions while his employees faced sudden layoffs. DeAndre brought the microphone to his lips. His deep, resonant baritone cut through Connor's pathetic whimpering. "You are not taking a jet anywhere, Connor," DeAndre stated, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "And you certainly are not taking her with you." Connor snapped his head around, glaring at his brother-in-law. "Shut up, DeAndre. You work for me. You do exactly what I tell you to do." "Not anymore," DeAndre replied smoothly. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He did not look at Connor. He looked directly at Brittany. "Isla tracked the money," DeAndre said, gesturing toward me with a nod of profound respect. "But as head of security, I tracked the communications. When Connor asked me to sweep his private office for listening devices last month, I made a backup of his encrypted voice memos. I thought I was protecting the company from corporate espionage. I had no idea I was documenting a sociopath." DeAndre tapped the screen of his phone, linking it to the conservatory's central audio system. "Brittany," DeAndre said, his tone entirely devoid of pity, "you need to hear exactly how your fiancé planned to protect his hidden cash." DeAndre pressed play. A sharp burst of static crackled over the high-fidelity speakers, followed immediately by the unmistakable arrogant drawl of Connor's voice. He sounded relaxed. He sounded completely in control. "Do not worry about the shell company." The recorded version of Connor echoed through the massive room. "The feds are slow. By the time they follow the blockchain breadcrumbs, the money will already be washed and sitting in the Zurich accounts. And if the Securities and Exchange Commission does catch on, if they actually manage to trace the primary holding corporation, it does not matter. I did not sign those specific incorporation documents. I put Brittany's name as the sole proprietor. The dumb blonde will take the fall." The audio file clicked off, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. Brittany stood frozen, her hands suspended in mid-air. She looked at the massive screens displaying the fraudulent offshore accounts. She looked at the venture capitalists who were now staring at her with predatory legal intent. The reality crashed down on her with the weight of a collapsing building. She was not just losing a billionaire lifestyle. She was the registered owner of a fraudulent shell company. She was facing decades in federal prison for crimes she did not even know she was committing. A guttural, piercing scream tore from her throat, a sound of absolute, unmitigated horror that shattered the final remains of the wedding. Brittany's scream acted as the starting gun for a high society stampede. The conservatory, which moments ago had been the pinnacle of Pacific Heights, elegance dissolved into absolute anarchy. The venture capitalists and tech executives who had previously been shouting threats were now sprinting for the exits. They trampled over scattered white orchid centerpieces, knocking over gold chivalry chairs in their desperate rush to escape. These were people whose entire livelihoods depended on reputation and pristine public relations. Nobody wanted their face captured by the catering staff's cell phones. Nobody wanted to be photographed anywhere near a man who had just been exposed for defrauding federal regulators and laundering millions. They did not care about the wedding favors or the open bar. They wanted out. The entire front row of investors vanished in under a minute, leaving behind a trail of abandoned champagne flutes, shattered crystal, and trampled silk napkins. Connor did not attempt to comfort Brittany. He did not spare a single glance for his mother, who was still curled in a catatonic ball on the marble floor. Self-preservation was the only instinct he had left. He shoved past Brittany so violently she stumbled backward into the floral archway, tearing a vine of white roses down with her. He bolted down the center aisle, pushing a bewildered groomsman out of his way, and sprinted toward the west wing of the estate. I did not run. I walked. The satisfying click of my heels against the marble provided a steady, unrelenting rhythm to the chaos erupting around me. I followed the path of destruction Connor left in his wake, moving past sobbing bridesmaids and shouting event coordinators. I knew exactly where he was going. When you cut off a fraudster's digital lifelines, they always run for their physical safety nets. I found him in the master bridal suite. The luxurious room looked as though a localized hurricane had ripped through it. Connor had completely abandoned his polished billionaire aesthetic. He was on his hands and knees frantically ripping the custom silk lining out of his monogrammed Louis Vuitton duffel bag. Designer shirts and expensive silk ties were thrown haphazardly across the plush white carpet. He was grunting in sheer panic, his fingers tearing at the seams of the leather luggage, desperately searching for the hidden compartment. "Looking for the false bottom, Connor?" I asked, leaning casually against the polished mahogany doorframe. Connor whipped his head around, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely unhinged. The perfectly styled hair he had sported at the altar was now matted to his forehead with sweat. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice a frantic, breathy hiss. "Where are the documents? If you are referring to the 3 emergency passports registered under the names of your fabricated board members?" "They are gone," I said, stepping fully into the room. "You really should not leave a bag with biometric locks unattended while taking groomsmen photos by the reflecting pool. Security protocols are incredibly easy to bypass when you know exactly which algorithms the manufacturer uses." Connor scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep them at his sides. "You stole my property!" I secured evidence. I corrected him, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You spent months preparing a failsafe. You funneled cash into those offshore accounts and created multiple identities so that the moment the auditors closed in, you could vanish. You thought you were playing a high-stakes game of chess, but you forgot that forensic auditing extends to physical assets. I tracked the purchase of those forged passports through a dark web ledger 3 weeks ago. I found them in your bag an hour before the ceremony began." Connor took a step forward, his chest heaving, but he stopped when I did not retreat. "I gave them to DeAndre." I continued, watching the last sliver of hope die in his eyes. "He has already handed them over to his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your aliases are burned. Your backup identities are currently sitting in an evidence locker. Every Border Patrol agent, private airstrip manager, and airport security checkpoint in the country has those faces flagged. You cannot leave this state, let alone the country." Connor realized his international escape route was entirely destroyed. He let out a feral, desperate yell, a sound born of pure, trapped panic, and charged at the door. I stepped aside smoothly, letting him barrel past me into the service hallway. He was not thinking clearly anymore. He was operating on pure adrenaline, convinced he could outrun a federal dragnet with whatever cash he had left in his tuxedo pockets. He was heading for the VIP valet lot. I followed at a leisurely pace, pushing open the heavy double doors that led out to the private parking area. The bright California sun was blinding after the dim lighting of the hallway, but the scene unfolding on the asphalt was crystal clear. Connor was sprinting across the lot, making a direct line for his absolute pride and joy. It was a custom matte black Ferrari, a $300,000 vehicle he had purchased the very day his Series B funding had cleared into his fraudulent accounts. He reached into his pocket, furiously pressing the unlock button on his key fob as he ran, but the sleek sports car did not beep. The custom headlights did not flash. Connor skidded to a halt, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the pavement. He stood frozen, his chest heaving as he stared at the reality directly in front of him. The Ferrari was already hoisted 2 feet into the air. 2 heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were parked firmly on either side of the sports car, effectively boxing it in. 3 men in high-visibility safety vests were moving with practiced efficiency, ratcheting thick steel cables around the axles and securing the vehicle to the hydraulic lift. The side of their trucks bore the logo of a premier asset recovery firm. "Hey!" Connor screamed, his voice cracking as he lunged forward, waving his arms wildly. "Get your hands off my car! Put it down right now! That is my property!" The lead repo man, a massive guy with a thick beard and a clipboard tucked neatly under his arm, paused his work. He secured the final winch, looked over his shoulder at the frantic, sweating groom in the ruined tuxedo, and offered Connor a bright, cheerful wave. The cheerful wave from the man in the high-visibility vest broke something fundamental inside Connor's mind. He stood absolutely paralyzed on the wet asphalt, staring at the suspended tires of his matte black Ferrari. He had spent the last 20 minutes watching his reputation, his marriage and his mother's financial security disintegrate on a massive screen, but seeing his $300,000 supercar chained to a tow truck was the final fracture in his reality. As if cued by the sheer theatricality of his ruin, the heavy gray clouds that had been gathering over the Pacific coastline suddenly broke open. There was no gentle drizzle. It was an instant torrential downpour. The rain fell in aggressive heavy sheets, slamming against the pavement and instantly soaking through Connor's bespoke tuxedo. Within seconds, the immaculate billionaire groom was reduced to a drenched, shivering mess, his expensive leather shoes sitting in a rapidly forming puddle. I stepped out through the double doors and stopped under the slight overhang of the portico. I did not bother to find an umbrella. The cold mist spraying against my face felt incredibly clarifying. I watched Connor process his trapped reality. The valet lot was bordered by high stone walls. The only exit was currently blocked by the 2 commercial tow trucks. There was nowhere left to run. Connor slowly turned around. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead and ran down his face in steady streams. When his bloodshot eyes locked onto me, the sheer panic that had been driving him morphed instantly into a venomous, unadulterated rage. He did not see a forensic auditor who had caught him committing federal crimes. He saw a woman who had refused to play her assigned role. He charged across the asphalt, his shoes slipping wildly on the wet ground. "This is your fault!" Connor screamed, his voice raw and tearing at his throat as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You ruined my life. You destroyed everything I built because you could not just smile and be quiet." He closed the distance between us, stopping just 2 feet away. The heat radiating off his furious body clashed with the freezing rain. He towered over me, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission exactly as he had always done in the boardroom. "You lacked basic subservience," he spat, the word flying from his mouth like a curse. "You were my partner. You were supposed to support my vision. A good woman would have looked the other way. A good woman would have understood the pressure I was under to keep the investors happy. But no, you had to dig. You had to meddle. You destroyed a billion-dollar empire because of your pathetic, fragile ego." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked at the man I had once believed was a genius and saw nothing but a sloppy, arrogant fraud. "You never had an empire, Connor," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy sound of the falling rain with absolute precision. "You had a poorly constructed Ponzi scheme wrapped in good public relations, and my ego had nothing to do with this. Your unbelievable stupidity is what brought you down." Connor let out a harsh, incredulous laugh, wiping the rain from his eyes. "You think you are so smart. You think you beat me." "I did beat you," I replied flatly. "And it was embarrassingly easy. You thought because I handled the standard payroll and tax compliance that I lacked the intellect to see what you were actually doing." You assumed my silence was subservience when in reality it was just observation. You left digital fingerprints the size of craters because you truly believed you were the smartest man in the world. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing him to hold his ground or retreat. I spent 3 months unweaving your financial web while you thought I was crying over our divorce. I told him, refusing to break eye contact. You used the exact same IP address to log into your Cayman Island shell accounts as you did to order room service at the Four Seasons. You authorized a $5 million wire transfer using hotel Wi-Fi Connor. I tracked the metadata on your forged PDF signatures. I cross-referenced the timestamps on the offshore deposits with your private flight logs. I sat in a windowless room in Geneva, pulling the incorporation documents for Horizon Ventures, and do you know what I found? Connor was breathing heavily, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. I found that you used your own mother's maiden name as the security password for the blind trust, I said, allowing a trace of genuine disgust to enter my voice. You built a house of cards out of incredibly lazy, arrogant mistakes. You underestimated me at every single turn. You thought you could steal $14 million, frame your mentor, bankrupt your mother, and marry an heiress without any consequences, because you never believed a woman you viewed as subservient possessed the intellect to dismantle your life. The absolute coldness of my logic broke his final restraint. The realization that he had not been outsmarted by a team of federal agents, but entirely dismantled by the woman he had discarded, drove him completely mad. Connor let out a guttural, primal roar. He drew his right arm back, his hand balling into a tight fist, and lunged forward with every ounce of his remaining strength, aiming a desperate, violent strike directly at my head. I did not even have time to raise my arms. Before Connor could close the final foot of distance between us, a massive force collided with his right side. DeAndre materialized from the heavy rain like a freight train. He hit Connor at full speed, wrapping his thick arms around the groom's torso and lifting him entirely off the wet pavement. The impact was brutal. DeAndre drove Connor backward across the driveway, slamming him face first into the side of a white catering van parked near the service entrance. The heavy metal of the van groaned loudly under the concussive force. Connor's breath left his lungs in a sharp, pained gasp, and his cheek smashed flat against the cold, wet side of the vehicle. DeAndre pinned his arms behind his back in a flawless, inescapable submission hold, pressing his own body weight against Connor to keep him immobilized. "Do not move a single muscle," DeAndre growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble against Connor's ear. Connor squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a pathetic, defeated whimper as the freezing rain continued to pour over them. Then the heavy iron gates of the vineyard swung open. The sound of high-performance engines roared over the storm. A fleet of 6 black unmarked SUVs tore up the long gravel driveway, their tires kicking up mud and water. They skidded to a halt in a precise tactical formation, effectively barricading the entire valet lot. The heavy doors of the SUVs swung open simultaneously. Men and women in dark windbreakers emblazoned with bold yellow FBI lettering stepped out into the torrential downpour. Brilliant red and blue strobe lights flashed from the dashboards of the vehicles, casting a frantic, swirling glow over the rain-slicked pavement, illuminating the exact moment Connor's fabricated life officially came to an end. The rain continued to pour, washing the mud from the driveway, as the red and blue lights illuminated my face. I stood perfectly still, watching the SUV lock its doors, a slow, cold smile spreading across my lips. The red and blue reflections of the federal vehicles faded into the California storm, marking the definitive end of Connor's reign. 2 weeks later, the torrential rain of the vineyard had been replaced by the crisp, blinding sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Seattle office. I sat behind a massive slab of polished obsidian that served as my desk, overlooking the bustling Puget Sound. Horizon Digital, the financial security firm I had quietly built, while Connor was busy defrauding his investors, occupied the entire top floor of the high-rise. The silence in my office was not the oppressive, fearful quiet of my previous life. It was the absolute, unshakable silence of complete control. My computer monitor displayed the latest Securities and Exchange Commission filings, confirming the rapid liquidation of Connor's fraudulent assets. The offshore accounts had been successfully seized by international authorities. The Malibu beach house was already listed for public auction. The federal indictment had been unsealed that morning, and the list of felony charges was devastating. The soft chime of my private intercom broke my concentration. I tapped the blinking light on the console. It was Marcus, the head of building security downstairs. He sounded remarkably tense, his usual professional tone strained by whatever situation was currently unfolding in the lobby. He informed me that a woman was causing a significant disturbance at the front desk. She was aggressively refusing to leave, loudly claiming she was my mother-in-law, and threatening to call the local press if she was not allowed upstairs immediately to speak with me. Marcus offered to have her physically escorted out by local law enforcement. I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair, staring out at the Seattle skyline. I knew exactly who was throwing a tantrum in my lobby. "Let her up," I instructed Marcus. "But send a security escort with her in the elevator. I do not want her wandering the corporate halls." 5 minutes later, the heavy glass doors to my executive suite swung open. Brenda Thorne stood on the threshold, and the physical sight of her was almost jarring. The woman who had collapsed in a pool of emerald silk at the wedding was completely unrecognizable. The meticulously maintained Pacific Heights matriarch had utterly vanished. Her custom designer clothes were gone, replaced by a wrinkled, off-the-rack beige trench coat and scuffed flat walking shoes. Her signature blonde blowout was flat, lifeless, and visibly graying at the roots. She clutched a cheap faux leather handbag to her chest, as if it were a tactical shield. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly exhausted by her new reality. The security guard stepped back into the hallway, pulling the glass door shut, and leaving us entirely alone in the massive corner office. Brenda stared at the sleek, minimalist decor, the original modern artwork on the walls, and finally at me. I did not stand to greet her. I simply folded my hands on the pristine desk and waited for her to make the first move. Isla Brenda began, her voice cracking immediately. It completely lacked the haughty, condescending drawl she had utilized every single time she criticized my wardrobe, my career, or my background during my marriage to her son. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes darting nervously around the imposing room. "I need your help. Please, you have to listen to me." "I am listening." "Brenda," I replied, my tone perfectly neutral and devoid of any warmth. "State your business." She stumbled toward the guest chair opposite my desk, but did not sit down. Her hands gripped the back of the white leather chair so tightly, her knuckles turned pale. "They are taking absolutely everything, Isla. The federal prosecutors froze all of my personal bank accounts. They locked me out of the family trust entirely. The bank delivered a foreclosure notice on the estate this morning at dawn. They are kicking me out of the house I have lived in for 30 years. I have absolutely nothing left to my name." "You enjoyed the luxury of Connor's stolen money for years," I pointed out, leaning forward slightly to ensure she heard every word. "You knew his initial startup capital came from a massive second mortgage on your estate, a mortgage he never paid back. You happily accepted the diamond tennis bracelets and the first-class tickets to Paris while actively ignoring where the funds were originating." "I am his mother," Brenda cried, a desperate wet sob tearing from her throat. "I was just supporting my boy. You know how stressful his work was. You know the pressure he was under to succeed and maintain our family name. I know that you enabled a sociopath," I corrected her, refusing to let her rewrite history to paint herself as a victim. "I know that when I found the first set of forged tax documents 3 years ago and brought them to you in strict confidence, you told me I was being hysterical. You told me my job was to manage the household and let Connor handle the complex finances because he was a visionary, and I was just a glorified accountant. You watched him systematically destroy his employees' lives to pad his own pockets, and you actively applauded his ruthless business acumen at every country club dinner we attended. You treated me like disposable hired help because I refused to worship his arrogance." Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks and dripping onto the collar of her cheap coat. I was wrong, Isla. I admit it. I was so incredibly wrong about you. But you proved your point. You took him down. He is sitting in a federal holding cell facing 20 years in maximum security. You have the ear of the SEC. You have deep connections with the FBI now. You can talk to Agent Reynolds. You can tell them I had no direct knowledge of the wire fraud. You can ask them to release the lien on the family estate. You are the only person on earth who can save my home. I stared at the woman who had spent years making me feel completely invisible and inadequate. Now stripped of the unearned wealth that had shielded her cruelty, she was begging the family scapegoat for salvation. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a small, crisp rectangle of cardstock. I placed it flat on the polished obsidian surface and slid it slowly across the desk. I can't save your house, Brenda, but I heard the building downstairs is hiring overnight janitors. It's the least I can do for family. Brenda stared at the business card. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sheer devastation of the insult shattered whatever remained of her pride. She let out a loud, agonizing sob, turning on her heel and fleeing toward the heavy glass doors. I watched her run, her cries echoing down the corridor long after the doors had closed behind her. The rain from the previous weeks had finally cleared, leaving the Seattle skyline sharp and brilliant through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my office. Vincent sat across from me, his posture stiff, his eyes locked on the sprawling spreadsheet illuminating the wall-mounted monitor. The man had aged a decade in the past 6 months. Connor had not just stolen Vincent's capital, he had stolen his legacy. Vincent had mentored Connor, brought him into the venture capital world, and treated him like a son, only to be gutted and left for dead in a fabricated corporate bankruptcy. We were not looking backward today, we were hunting. Connor's final muddy scream outside the vineyard still echoed in my mind. He had bragged about $5 million hidden in an untraceable offshore trust. He wanted me to know that no matter what the federal agents took, he had managed to secure a golden parachute. He believed his decentralized accounts were entirely invisible. He believed he was still the smartest person in the room. Vincent rubbed his temples, letting out a heavy sigh that carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. I have run the Horizon Ledger through 3 different proprietary auditing algorithms, Isla, he said, sounding entirely defeated. The federal regulators have frozen 64 separate accounts. The remaining capital is simply gone. It is a ghost. He used cryptocurrency tumblers to wash the funds before shifting them overseas. We are chasing smoke. You are looking for the 5 million, Vincent, I replied, my fingers flying across my mechanical keyboard. That is your mistake. You do not catch a thief by looking for the vault. You catch a thief by tracking the dust he leaves on the floor. I brought up a secondary terminal window, pulling raw transaction data directly from the servers of a disgraced Cayman Island banking institution. The Securities and Exchange Commission had given me unprecedented access to the seized servers as a reward for my informant work. Connor is arrogant, but he is fundamentally lazy, I explained, keeping my eyes locked on the cascading lines of code and routing numbers. When you move large sums of money through decentralized tumblers, the service takes a fraction of a percentage as a transaction fee. It is automatic. But Connor hated paying fees. He thought he could outsmart the blockchain by creating a closed-loop system of dummy corporations to bounce the money between his own controlled nodes, effectively washing the funds without paying a cent to third-party brokers. Vincent leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he tried to follow my logic, so he moved it himself. Exactly, I said, tapping a specific line of code and highlighting it in bright red. And when you move money yourself, you have to test the plumbing. You do not just hit send on $5 million and hope it lands in Zurich. You send a test transaction first. A tiny, insignificant amount to ensure the routing protocols are active and the receiving account is functioning. I expanded the red highlighted row, blowing it up so it dominated the central screen. He did not wash the money through crypto, I stated, feeling the familiar cold thrill of the hunt. He used a cascading series of wire transfers through shell companies in nations with strict bank secrecy laws. But he tested the final connection with a microtransaction of exactly $12.50. Vincent stood up from his chair, walking closer to the screen. You tracked $12. I tracked the $12 because it bypassed the standard corporate routing I told him, bringing up the receiving account details. It originated from a shell company called Apex Holdings, which we already know Connor controlled. But it did not go to a bank. It went to a boutique real estate holding firm based in the British Virgin Islands. My fingers flew across the keyboard again, bypassing the standard public registries and utilizing a backdoor access portal I had built during my marriage to Connor. I knew his password structures. I knew the specific logic he used to generate encryption keys. It took less than 3 minutes to break through the holding firm's basic security protocols. The screen flashed green, granting me access to the firm's private client registry. I filtered the database for transactions originating from Apex Holdings. The result popped up instantly. It was not a bank account. It was a property deed. Connor did not hide the money in a vault. I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. He bought an island. Vincent let out a sharp gasp, staring at the high-resolution aerial photographs that populated the screen. It was a stunning, secluded private compound in the Caribbean. A massive modern villa perched on white sand, complete with a private deep-water dock and a helipad. The purchase price listed on the digital deed was exactly $5 million. The transaction had cleared precisely 4 days before his disastrous wedding. He bought a non-extradition sanctuary. Vincent whispered, his voice thick with absolute disbelief. He really thought he was going to slip the federal net and live like a king on a private beach. He thought he had a perfect escape plan. I agreed, pulling up the final incorporation documents for the LLC that held the deed to the island. But this is where Connor's arrogance transforms into absolute malice. He knew the federal government would eventually find this property. Even if he made it to the island, the FBI would initiate international seizure protocols. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone else to take the fall for purchasing property with stolen corporate funds. I opened the final PDF document, zooming in on the registration details for the Caribbean LLC. Look at the managing director, Vincent. Look at the primary beneficiary listed on the deed. Vincent leaned in, tracing his finger along the digital document. He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening in complete shock. He did not put the island in his name, Vincent said, his voice rising in panic. No, I replied, sitting back in my chair and folding my arms. He did not use his mother's name either. He registered the entire $5 million fraudulent asset using Brittany's social security number. Her digital signature is stamped on every single page of the closing documents. The sheer cruelty of Connor's plan was staggering. He had not just planned to flee, he had meticulously engineered a trap for his new bride. The moment the federal government discovered the Caribbean property, they would not just seize the asset. They would look at the registration documents and conclude that Brittany was actively participating in the money laundering scheme. Connor handed her a massive federal indictment as a wedding gift, I stated, looking at the irrefutable evidence of his betrayal. The FBI is not going to just seize that island. They are going to arrest Brittany for international wire fraud before the end of the week. I did not invite Brittany to my high-rise office. She no longer possessed the social currency to pass through my lobby, and she certainly did not deserve the view of the Seattle skyline. Instead, I texted her an address for a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the industrial district. It was a sterile, unforgiving place, illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a sickly green pallor over the sticky vinyl booths. The air smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee, a sharp contrast to the lavender and vanilla-scented air of the bridal suites she had occupied just 2 weeks prior. I sat in the corner booth sipping ice water, completely indifferent to the grim surroundings. The bell above the door chimed, and Brittany walked in. There was absolutely no trace of the radiant, arrogant heiress who had sneered at me during her wedding rehearsals. She wore a shapeless, oversized gray sweater and dark sunglasses that did nothing to hide her swollen, red-rimmed eyes. Her usually immaculate blonde hair was pulled back into a messy knot. She looked terrified, her gaze darting around the cheap diner as if expecting federal agents to step out from the kitchen. She spotted me and practically stumbled toward the booth, sliding into the vinyl seat across from me. Her hands were shaking so violently that she knocked a plastic menu against the metal napkin dispenser. Isla, she whispered, her voice a fragile, raspy thread. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I did not know who else to call. The lawyers my family hired will not even return my messages anymore. They say the federal hold on my assets makes me a liability. I did not offer her any pleasantries. I did not ask how she was holding up. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it flat on the chipped formica table between us. I slid it precisely to the edge of her side of the booth. It was a copy of the property deed for the $5 million private island in the Caribbean. Her social security number, printed in stark black ink, was highlighted in bright yellow. Brittany stared at the paper as if it were coated in a lethal poison. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her cheeks, slipping beneath the frames of her oversized sunglasses. I did not know, she gasped, burying her face in her trembling hands. I swear to you, Isla, I never knew he was stealing. I never knew about the offshore accounts. I am pregnant. She dropped her hands, looking at me with a desperate, wide-eyed panic. I found out 3 days after the raid. She continued, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. The stress is destroying me. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I am carrying his child, and the FBI showed up at my leased apartment yesterday at dawn. They handed me a target letter. They told me I am facing federal indictment for international money laundering and tax evasion. I watched her cry, feeling an absolute glacial calm. You are the sole legal beneficiary of a $5 million fraudulent asset, Brittany. The FBI does not care about your tears, and they certainly do not care about your romance. They care about signatures on corporate documents linking stolen investor capital to offshore holdings. You signed the incorporation papers for the shell company. Your digital fingerprint is on the wire transfers. You are facing 10 years in federal prison. Brittany shook her head frantically, wiping the tears from her chin. But I did not authorize those transfers. Connor made me sign them. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper as she explained the trap her genius groom had set for her. It was the night before the wedding, she explained, her voice cracking with the humiliating reality of her own foolishness. We were in the bridal suite. Connor came in with a massive stack of legal documents. He poured me a glass of expensive champagne, kissed my neck, and told me his attorneys needed a revised prenuptial agreement signed immediately before the ceremony. He said it was just standard asset protection. He said he was securing our future. He just kept flipping the pages, pointing to the bottom line, telling me where to sign. I never read a single paragraph. I trusted him. I signed away my entire life because I thought I was securing a billionaire lifestyle. You signed ownership papers for illegal shell companies, I corrected her, keeping my tone flat and clinical. You made yourself the managing director of a criminal enterprise. Connor knew the federal government would eventually track the missing $5 million. He set you up to take the fall so he could bargain for a reduced sentence by offering you to the prosecutors. Brittany let out a wounded, suffocating gasp. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, rocking slightly in the vinyl booth. He is a monster. He used me. He ruined my life. Please, Isla, you know the federal agents. You gave them the evidence. You have to tell them I was manipulated. You have to save me. I reached into my briefcase a second time and withdrew a thick manila folder, placing it directly over the Caribbean deed. I unclipped a silver pen from my collar and set it beside the folder. I am not here to grant you mercy, Brittany, I stated, locking my eyes onto hers, ensuring she understood the absolute gravity of the moment. I am here to recover the $5 million Connor stole from Vincent and the other investors. I am here to dismantle Connor's defense strategy before he even steps foot inside a courtroom. I tapped the manila folder with my index finger. Inside this folder is an irrevocable transfer of assets. You are going to sign full ownership of the Caribbean island and the associated shell companies over to the Federal Restitution Fund to pay back the people Connor defrauded. Furthermore, you are going to sign a formal agreement to turn state's witness against your husband. You will testify in open court. You will tell the federal jury exactly how he manipulated you into signing those fraudulent documents the night before your wedding. You will secure his conviction. Brittany stared at the folder, her chest heaving as she processed the sheer ruthlessness of the deal. She looked up at me, her eyes begging for an alternative that simply did not exist, or what she whispered. I leaned forward, closing the distance across the sticky table. My voice dropped to a quiet, lethal register. Or I hand the unredacted evidence file directly to the federal prosecutor tomorrow morning, and you give birth in a cell. Brittany did not say another word. She grabbed the silver pen and pulled the folder toward her. Her hands were still shaking, but she pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name on every single page. I pulled the folder back across the chipped formica table, ensuring the ink was dry, before sliding the flawless confession into my leather briefcase. Brittany remained frozen in the vinyl booth, her hands empty, her future entirely out of her control. I stood up, walked out of the diner without a backward glance, and stepped into the cool, damp Seattle night. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and set the briefcase on the passenger side. The streetlights reflected off the damp asphalt, casting a sharp electric glow across the dashboard. Before I could even start the engine, my phone vibrated loudly in the cup holder. The caller ID did not display a name or a familiar number. It displayed a generic, restricted government warning label. I tapped the screen to accept the call. The automated voice that greeted me was sterile, metallic, and precise. You have a collect call from an inmate at the Federal Detention Center, SeaTac. Press 1 to accept. I pressed the button. The line clicked. Heavy, echoing static filled the small space of my car, backed by the unmistakable oppressive sounds of a maximum security holding facility. I could hear the distant, harsh clanging of heavy iron doors shutting. I could hear the muffled, echoing shout of a corrections officer. Then, cutting through the background noise, came the sound of ragged, uneven breathing. Isla. His voice was a ghost of its former self. The booming, charismatic baritone that had commanded boardrooms, intimidated rivals, and charmed venture capitalists was entirely gone. In its place was a thin, raspy tremor. Connor sounded exactly like what he was, a cornered animal trapped in a concrete cage. I am here, I said, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any sympathy or warmth. Please do not hang up, he begged, the desperation bleeding through the phone speaker. My lawyers will not even take my calls anymore. The public defender they assigned me looks like he just graduated law school. They have me in solitary for my own protection, Isla. It is freezing in here. They took my shoelaces. They took my belt. They took absolutely everything. I stared out the windshield at the flickering neon sign of the diner. Actions have consequences, Connor. You built a career on defrauding people. You stole from your mentors and ruined your own family. The federal government tends to frown upon that. I know, he choked out, his voice cracking loudly. I know I was arrogant. I know I treated you terribly. You were right about everything. You were always the smartest person in the room. I was just too blind and too insecure to admit it. It was a masterful performance. If I had been the same naive woman who married him 5 years ago, that sudden display of vulnerability might have moved me. But I had spent months dissecting his psychological profile alongside his financial ledgers. I knew he was entirely incapable of genuine remorse. Connor only felt sorry that he had been caught. He was attempting to weaponize our shared history, trying to locate a soft spot in my armor that simply no longer existed. Skip the apology, Connor, I commanded, cutting through his manufactured tears. Federal inmates only get 15 minutes of phone time per day. Do not waste yours attempting to manipulate me. What do you want? He swallowed hard. The sound was amplified over the receiver. When he spoke again, the crying had magically stopped, replaced by the frantic, calculating tone of a man trying to close a desperate, impossible deal. They are hitting me with the maximum sentencing guidelines, he said rapidly, his words tumbling over each other. Wire fraud, money laundering, corporate conspiracy. The prosecutor is pushing for 20 years. 20 years, Isla. I will die in here. But my defense attorney found a loophole. A tiny sliver of a chance. He paused, waiting for me to ask. I remained absolutely silent, forcing him to fill the void. The offshore accounts. Connor continued, panic lacing his tone. The Cayman trusts and the dummy corporations. If you testify that those accounts were established while we were still legally married, if you sign a sworn affidavit stating that we created those entities together as joint marital assets for tax deferral purposes, the defense can reclassify the entire structure. They can argue it is a civil marital dispute regarding hidden assets rather than criminal money laundering. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. He was sitting in a federal prison cell facing decades of incarceration, and his grand survival strategy was to ask the woman he had emotionally abused to commit perjury and implicate herself in his financial crimes. "You want me to claim joint ownership of your illegal slush fund?" I clarified, making sure the absolute absurdity of his plan was spoken aloud. Just on paper, he pleaded, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. Just enough to introduce reasonable doubt for the jury. It could shave 10 years off my sentence. "Isla, please. I will give you whatever is left. When I get out, I will sign over any remaining equity. I will owe you my life. You have punished me enough. You won. You completely destroyed me. Now please just show a little mercy." I leaned back against the leather seat, resting my hand on the manila folder containing Brittany's signed confession. I listened to his ragged breathing over the lines, savoring the absolute power I held over his destiny. He truly believed he could still charm his way out of a federal indictment. He truly believed I was still the quiet, subservient wife he could command. I let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the connection. I let him sit in the cold, echoing reality of his concrete cell while he waited for his salvation. "Connor," I finally said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "You fundamentally misunderstand your current situation. You think you are negotiating a business deal. You think we are still playing a game." "Isla, please," he whimpered. "I will not be signing a sworn affidavit," I stated clearly, pronouncing every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "I will not be claiming joint ownership of your fraudulent accounts, and I will certainly not be testifying for the defense." Why, he screamed, the sudden rage fracturing his pathetic facade. "You have everything you wanted. Why are you doing this to me?" I laughed softly into the receiver. The sound was cold, genuine, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Connor, I won't be testifying for the defense. The prosecution just hired me as their lead expert witness. See you in court." A guttural, animalistic sound tore from his throat. It was the raw, unfiltered sound of a man realizing his life was definitively, permanently over. I pressed the red button on my screen, cutting off his screaming voice mid-breath, and dropped the phone into the passenger seat. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the gallery. Connor sat at the defense table, a hollow shell of the man who had once commanded boardrooms and belittled everyone in his orbit. He was drowning in an oversized, faded orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy iron chain around his waist. His usually perfectly styled hair was lank and thinning, and his skin carried the sallow gray tint of a man who had not seen direct sunlight in months. In the second row of the gallery, his mother Brenda sat clutching a damp tissue to her chest. She looked entirely broken, her eyes darting frantically around the room as if waiting for a punchline to a cruel joke that was never coming. The federal prosecutor called me to the stand. I smoothed the skirt of my tailored navy suit and walked past Connor without breaking my stride. I did not look at him. I took the oath, sat down, and adjusted the microphone. The defense attorney, a perpetually sweating public defender who had clearly drawn the short straw in representing Connor, stood up to begin his cross-examination. He paced in front of the jury box, attempting to weave a narrative of a misunderstood financial genius. He suggested that the offshore trusts were simply aggressive joint marital tax strategies that had gotten terribly out of hand. He tried to argue that I was fully aware of the Cayman accounts, positioning Connor as a victim of complicated corporate tax law rather than a criminal mastermind. I did not let him finish his narrative. I leaned into the microphone, my voice ringing out with absolute chilling clarity. "There was no joint marital strategy," I stated, staring directly at the jury. "Connor Blackwood engineered a closed-loop system of dummy corporations specifically designed to evade federal oversight and defraud his investors. He utilized cryptocurrency tumblers to wash the capital, but he bypassed standard blockchain brokers to save on transaction fees. I tracked his personal routing codes. I traced the microtransactions he used to test the international wire transfers. Furthermore, he explicitly excluded my name from every single incorporation document right up until the moment he needed a scapegoat. I pulled a stack of highlighted documents from my folder, the very same files I had used to corner Brittany in the diner. When the federal net began to close, I continued my gaze shifting to Connor, who was now visibly trembling in his seat. He purchased a $5 million sanctuary property in the Caribbean. He did not put the deed in his name. He used the social security number of his new bride to register the asset, ensuring that when the FBI inevitably seized the property, she would be the one facing federal indictment for money laundering. It was not a mistake. It was a calculated, malicious trap. The defense attorney stopped pacing. He looked down at his legal pad, realizing he had absolutely nothing to counter the irrefutable paper trail I had just laid out. He stammered a quiet surrender, offering no further questions, and retreated to his chair. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corporate theft, looked down at Connor from her elevated bench. She did not bother to mask her absolute disgust. "Connor Blackwood," she began, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom like a blade. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a fraud case executed with such staggering arrogance and profound disregard for human life. You did not just steal capital. You attempted to destroy the lives of your mentors, your colleagues, and your own family to shield yourself from accountability. Your actions are a masterclass in hubris and malice." Connor opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised her hand, silencing him instantly. "It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve a sentence of 15 years. Given the scope and severity of your financial crimes, this sentence is to be served consecutively without the possibility of early parole." The wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block. The noise was definitive, absolute, and utterly perfect. Connor let out a raw, guttural cry as two federal marshals grabbed him by the arms and hauled him to his feet. He thrashed against their grip, twisting his neck to look at me one last time, his eyes wide with a frantic, begging desperation. I simply held his gaze, my expression completely blank, until the heavy wooden door behind the judge's bench swallowed him whole. From the gallery, Brenda let out a loud, shattering wail, collapsing into the arms of a relative. I stood up from the witness stand, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked out into the crisp Seattle air, taking my first truly free breath in years. Exactly 1 year later, the dreary Seattle rain felt like a distant, faded memory. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before me, a brilliant expanse of glittering blue, crashing gently against the white sand of the Malibu coastline. I stood on the sprawling teak balcony of my new home, letting the warm California breeze wash over my face. It was a stunning multi-tiered architectural masterpiece of glass and steel. It was also the exact property Connor had originally attempted to purchase with his stolen millions to use as his non-extradition sanctuary. When the federal government seized the asset and put it up for public liquidation, I attended the auction. I bought his dream house for a fraction of its market value, using the massive bonus I had received just weeks prior when my firm officially promoted me to senior partner. I had taken the corner office, I had taken my life back, and I had taken his sanctuary. The sound of sliding glass pulled me from my thoughts. DeAndre stepped out onto the balcony, looking healthier and more relaxed than I had ever seen him. The heavy, dark circles under his eyes were completely gone. After Connor's spectacular arrest, DeAndre had filed for divorce, stripped Sydney of her access to his accounts, and secured a ruthless, ironclad settlement. Unburdened by her constant demands and toxic presence, he had launched his own boutique aviation company, which was already dominating the West Coast luxury market. He was closely followed by Vincent, who carried a silver tray holding 3 crystal flutes and a bottle of vintage champagne. Vincent's venture capital firm had not only recovered the stolen funds through the Restitution Act, but had doubled its portfolio in the past 12 months. He looked entirely at peace. Vincent popped the cork, the celebratory sound echoing over the crashing waves below. He poured the golden liquid into the flutes and handed them out. "To new beginnings," DeAndre said, raising his glass, a genuine, unburdened smile lighting up his face. "And to leaving the dead weight exactly where it belongs." Vincent raised his glass to meet DeAndre's. To justice, he added, his voice carrying the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who had watched a predator fall into a trap of his own making. I looked at the two men who had stood by me then, out at the endless, brilliant horizon. I raised my crystal flute, the sunlight catching the bubbles rising to the surface. To sweet vengeance, I replied, my voice steady, confident, and entirely my own. And to the dawn. We clinked our glasses together, the delicate chime ringing out clear and true against the sound of the ocean as I finally turned my back on the past and stepped fully into the light. The core lesson embedded in this sweet vengeance narrative is that true self-worth is never defined by the conditional approval of toxic family members. When repeatedly treated as a scapegoat, it is incredibly easy to internalize that false narrative. However, the protagonist's journey powerfully illustrates that quiet resilience, financial independence, and unwavering self-belief are the ultimate equalizers. True empowerment comes from strategically building a successful, independent life out of the ashes of rejection. When you finally stop seeking their validation, you strip away their power entirely. Have you ever walked away from a toxic environment to find your true strength? Share your story in the comments below.